Picture this. You're a sailor aboard one of the most powerful warships ever built, the USS Harry S, Truman. You've said goodbye to your family, packed your bags, and prepared for what you thought would be a 7-month deployment. 7 months away from home. 7 months of sacrifice. But then, just as you're counting down the days until you see your loved ones again, you get the news. Your deployment has been extended. Not by a few weeks, not by a month, but indefinitely. The homecoming you dreamed about every single night? Cancelled. The reunion with your children? Postponed. Your entire life put on hold. This isn't just a story about military operations or geopolitical strategy. This is a story about human beings pushed to their absolute limits. This is the story of the USS Harry S, Truman deployment crisis of 2018 and 2019, and how it nearly broke the spirit of thousands of sailors who serve our nation. Let me take you back to April 2018. The USS Harry S, Truman, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, one of the crown jewels of American naval power, departed Naval Station Norfolk in Virginia. On board were approximately 5,000 sailors, aviators, and Marines. These weren't just numbers on a roster. These were mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, husbands and wives. Each one of them had said their tearful goodbyes, promising to return home in 7 months. 7 months was the standard deployment length. It was what they had planned for, what their families had prepared for. Children had calendars marked with the homecoming date. Spouses had arranged their work schedules around the return. Everyone had a plan. The Truman Strike Group, which included the aircraft carrier and several accompanying ships, was heading to the Middle East. Their mission was to support Operation Inherent Resolve, the ongoing campaign against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. This was important work, dangerous work, but it was work these sailors had trained for and accepted as their duty. They left port with determination and pride, ready to serve their country for those 7 months and then come home. But the United States Navy and the Department of Defense had other plans. Plans that would change everything for these 5,000 souls floating in the waters of the Persian Gulf. As the months passed, the Truman and its crew performed admirably. They launched countless airstrikes against ISIS positions. They provided crucial air support for ground operations. They maintained a constant presence in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. The work was exhausting. Days blurred into nights. The rhythm of carrier operations never stopped. Flight deck crews worked in brutal heat, often exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit on the deck. Pilots flew mission after mission. Maintenance crews kept aircraft flying despite limited resources and punishing conditions. Below deck, the entire support structure of the ship worked around the clock. Cooks prepared thousands of meals daily. Engineers kept the nuclear reactors running. Medical personnel treated everything from minor injuries to serious emergencies. Everyone had a role. Everyone was tired. But everyone pushed forward because they knew they were going home soon. Then came September 2018. The rumors started circulating through the ship like wildfire. Whispers in the mess halls. Quiet conversations in berthing areas. Something was happening. Something was changing. And then, the official announcement came down from leadership. The deployment was being extended. The 7 months they had signed up for was now going to be 8 months. Then 9. The crew absorbed this news with a mixture of frustration and resignation. Extensions happened sometimes. It wasn't what they wanted, but they were professionals. They would push through. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that this was just the beginning. By December 2018, as the holiday season approached, morale aboard the Truman was deteriorating. Imagine spending Christmas away from your family when you were supposed to be home months ago. Imagine your children opening presents without you there. Imagine missing birthdays, anniversaries, first steps, first words, school plays, everything that makes life meaningful. The psychological toll was immense. Sailors began showing signs of serious stress. Depression rates climbed. Anxiety became pervasive. The ship's mental health resources, already stretched thin, were overwhelmed. Chaplains worked overtime, providing counseling and support to sailors who were reaching their breaking points. Some sailors reported feeling abandoned by the Navy leadership. Others felt betrayed. The promise of 7 months had been broken, and with it, the trust between the institution and the individuals who served it. The situation grew even more dire in early 2019. In April 2019, exactly 1 year after the deployment began, the Navy made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the entire Truman crew. Due to emerging threats and operational requirements, the deployment would be extended again. And this time, there was no clear end date. The words indefinite extension struck like a hammer blow. Sailors who had already been deployed for 12 months, 5 months longer than originally planned, were now told they had no idea when they would see their families again. Some had newborn children they had never met. Others had spouses struggling to keep households running alone. Many had aging parents they worried about constantly. The emotional weight was crushing. Reports began emerging from the ship about the human cost of this extended deployment. Family problems escalated dramatically. Divorce rates among Truman sailors spiked. Spouses back home, many of whom had young children and full-time jobs, were reaching their own breaking points. They had planned for 7 months of single parenting, of handling all household responsibilities alone, of living with constant worry about their loved one's safety. But 7 months had turned into 12, then 13, then 14. Some marriages couldn't survive the strain. Some relationships simply collapsed under the weight of prolonged separation and uncertainty. And the sailors aboard the Truman could do nothing but watch their personal lives crumble from thousands of miles away. The physical toll on the crew was equally severe. Extended deployments mean extended exposure to the unique stresses of carrier operations. The flight deck of an aircraft carrier is one of the most dangerous work environments in the world. Heavy machinery moving at high speeds, aircraft launching and landing constantly, jet engines that can suck in a human being or blast them overboard. All of this happening in a confined space with hundreds of people working simultaneously. Under normal deployment conditions, this is manageable. Crews are trained for it. But after months of extended operations, fatigue sets in, reaction times slow, mistakes become more likely, and mistakes on a carrier flight deck can be fatal. There were reports of increased accidents and near misses aboard the Truman during this period. Equipment failures became more common as systems were pushed beyond their normal maintenance cycles. Parts wore out faster than they could be replaced. Repairs that should have been done in port had to be improvised at sea. The ship itself was showing the strain of the extended deployment, just like its crew. Aviation maintenance personnel were working impossible hours trying to keep aircraft mission-ready. Some maintenance crews reported working 20-hour days, catching sleep in brief increments wherever they could. This level of operational tempo is simply unsustainable for extended periods, yet the Truman crew was living it day after day after day. Meanwhile, back in the United States, families were organizing. Spouses of Truman sailors began connecting through social media, sharing their frustrations and fears. They created support networks, helping each other through the impossible situation they found themselves in. Some began reaching out to elected officials, writing letters to senators and congresspeople, demanding answers. Why was this deployment being extended so far beyond its original timeline? What was so critical that the Navy couldn't rotate in a fresh carrier strike group? Why were their loved ones being asked to sacrifice so much more than what they had agreed to? The questions poured in, but satisfactory answers were hard to come by. The Navy's official position was that the extension was necessary due to operational requirements in the Middle East and gaps in carrier availability. The U.S. carrier fleet was stretched thin. Years of deferred maintenance and extended deployments across the entire fleet meant there weren't always carriers ready to deploy when needed. The Truman was already in position, already operational, and already experienced in the region. From a purely operational standpoint, extending the Truman made strategic sense. But strategy is made up of people, and those people were suffering. The Navy found itself caught between operational necessity and human welfare, and for the sailors of the Truman, it felt like the institution had chosen operations over people. Let me tell you about some of the individual stories that emerged from this crisis, because numbers and statistics can't capture the human reality. There was a petty officer whose wife gave birth to their first child 2 months after he deployed. He had now missed an entire year of his daughter's life. He had seen her only through video calls, watched her grow through a screen, never held her, never comforted her when she cried, never experienced the profound joy and terror of being a new parent. His wife, dealing with postpartum challenges alone, was exhausted and resentful. Their marriage was strained to the breaking point, and there was nothing he could do about it from the deck of a carrier in the Persian Gulf. There was a young aviation mechanic who received word that his father had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He requested emergency leave to go home and see his father one last time. The request went up the chain of command, was considered and ultimately denied. The operational tempo was too high. They couldn't spare personnel. He was needed on the ship. So he stayed, performing his duties professionally while dying inside. He spoke to his father via phone when he could, precious conversations that couldn't make up for not being there in person. His father passed away while he was still deployed. He attended the funeral via video link, watching on a laptop screen as his family buried his father without him there. The guilt and grief were overwhelming, compounded by anger at the institution that had prevented him from being there. There was a female officer who had been engaged before the deployment. The wedding had been planned for September 2018, timed perfectly for when she was supposed to return. As the deployment extended, the wedding was postponed once, then twice, then again. The venue was lost. Deposits were forfeited. Family members who had made travel arrangements canceled their plans. The stress of constant rescheduling and uncertainty strained her relationship with her fiancé. Eventually, he told her he couldn't do this anymore. The engagement was broken off. She lost not just the wedding she had dreamed of, but the future she had planned. And she had to process this heartbreak while continuing to stand watch, to lead her division, to project strength and confidence to the sailors under her command. These weren't isolated incidents. These were patterns repeating across the entire crew. Every division had stories like these. Every department had sailors dealing with personal crises they couldn't address because they were trapped thousands of miles from home with no end date in sight. The psychological impact was profound and pervasive. Ship counselors reported unprecedented demand for mental health services. Some sailors developed serious depression. Others experienced anxiety attacks. Some struggled with insomnia, unable to quiet their minds enough to sleep despite their exhaustion. Others slept too much, retreating from reality whenever possible. The ship's medical department dispensed psychiatric medications at rates far exceeding normal deployment patterns. Morale, that intangible but crucial element of military effectiveness, plummeted to dangerous lows. You could see it in how sailors moved through the ship. The energy was different. The camaraderie that normally sustained crews through difficult deployments was fraying. People were shorter with each other, quicker to anger, less willing to help. The sense that they were all in this together, that they were a team working toward a common goal, was eroding. Some sailors reported feeling that their service, their sacrifice, was being taken for granted. That the Navy saw them as tools to be used rather than people to be cared for. This feeling of being devalued, of being expendable, created a deep sense of betrayal among many crew members. Leadership aboard the Truman faced an impossible challenge. The commanding officer and the senior enlisted leadership knew their crew was suffering. They saw it every day. They heard about it in every conversation. But they also had orders. They had a mission to complete. They had to maintain operational readiness even as their crew approached breaking points. So they did what military leaders have always done in impossible situations. They tried to balance mission accomplishment with care for their people. They implemented morale programs, organized activities, tried to create moments of relief and normalcy amid the grinding routine of extended deployment. But these efforts, well-intentioned as they were, couldn't compensate for the fundamental reality that these sailors needed to go home. The Navy leadership at higher levels was aware of the crisis developing aboard the Truman. Reports flowed up the chain of command. Senior admirals knew the crew was struggling, but they were facing their own impossible calculus. The geopolitical situation in the Middle East remained volatile. ISIS, while weakened, was not completely defeated. Iran was conducting increasingly aggressive operations in the region. The presence of a carrier strike group was deemed essential for American interests and regional stability. And there simply wasn't another carrier ready to relieve the Truman. The maintenance backlog across the carrier fleet meant ships were in repair yards longer than planned. Training cycles for new deployments took time. The strategic-level decision-makers were stuck between competing imperatives, operational necessity versus human welfare, and the weight of that decision fell on the 5,000 sailors of the Truman. In May 2019, more than 13 months into the deployment, the Navy finally announced a relief plan. Another carrier strike group would deploy to relieve the Truman. The crew received this news with a mixture of relief and bitter exhaustion. Finally, after more than a year away from home, they would be coming back. But the announcement came with a caveat. The relief wouldn't happen immediately. It would take several more weeks to get the replacement carrier in position. So the wait continued. Days that felt like weeks. Weeks that felt like months. The psychological torture of knowing the end was coming, but not knowing exactly when. Sailors counted hours, not days. Every sunrise was another day of deployment. Every sunset was one day closer to home, but still not home. Finally, in July 2019, 15 months after the deployment began, the USS Harry S. Truman began its journey back to Naval Station Norfolk. The deployment that was supposed to last 7 months had stretched to 15 months. More than twice the original duration. As the Virginia coast came into view, as the ship approached the pier, emotions ran high. Some sailors wept openly. Others stood in silence, almost unable to process that the ordeal was finally over. On the pier, families waited. Children held welcome home signs. Spouses craned their necks looking for first glimpses of their loved ones. The reunion scenes were intensely emotional. Families embracing after more than a year apart. Parents meeting babies for the first time. Children running into the arms of mothers and fathers they had desperately missed. But amid the joy, there was also pain. Some sailors returned to find their marriages over. Others came home to children who barely recognized them. The extended deployment had created wounds that wouldn't heal quickly or easily. The aftermath of the Truman deployment crisis sparked serious conversations within the Navy and the broader Department of Defense about deployment policies and personnel management. How had the system allowed a deployment to extend so far beyond its original parameters? What mechanisms had failed that led to such severe impacts on crew welfare? Navy leadership acknowledged that the situation had been untenable and that changes needed to be made. The Secretary of the Navy and the Chief of Naval Operations issued statements recognizing the sacrifice of the Truman crew and pledging to address the systemic issues that had led to the crisis. But statements and acknowledgments, while appreciated, couldn't give back the lost time, couldn't repair the broken marriages, couldn't erase the trauma of those 15 months. Some good did come from this painful experience. The Navy implemented new policies regarding deployment lengths and extensions. Guidelines were established to prevent deployments from extending as drastically as the Trumans had. There was increased emphasis on maintaining carrier readiness so that relief ships would be available when needed. Mental health resources for deployed sailors were enhanced. Family support programs were strengthened. The institution learned from the Truman crisis, though that learning came at a tremendous human cost. The sailors who lived through those 15 months paid the price for lessons that would benefit future generations of naval personnel. But we must ask ourselves deeper questions about what the Truman crisis reveals about military service in the 21st century. How do we balance national security requirements with the human needs of service members? What obligations does the nation have to those who volunteer to defend it? When we ask men and women to serve, to deploy, to face danger and hardship, what promises do we make to them? And what happens when we break those promises? The Truman sailors signed up to serve their country. They accepted the risks and hardships of military service. They agreed to deploy for 7 months. But they didn't sign up for 15 months of separation from their families. They didn't consent to missing a year of their children's lives. They didn't agree to have their personal relationships destroyed by extended absence. The social contract between the military and its members was violated during the Truman deployment, and that violation had real, lasting consequences. There's also a broader context we need to understand. The Truman crisis wasn't an isolated incident caused by unique circumstances. It was a symptom of larger problems within the U.S. Navy and the military as a whole. The American military has been engaged in continuous operations for decades now. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, operations in Syria, missions in Africa, naval presence operations around the world. This operational tempo has strained the force in ways that aren't always visible to the public. Ships need maintenance, aircraft need repairs, and most importantly, people need rest. When the operational tempo is relentless, when there's always another mission, always another deployment, always another requirement, something has to give. And too often, what gives is the welfare of the service members themselves. The Navy's carrier fleet is particularly stressed. These massive ships, engineering marvels that project American power around the globe, require enormous amounts of maintenance. Nuclear reactors need servicing. Hull structures need inspection and repair. Complex electronic systems need updating. When carriers are kept at sea longer than planned, maintenance gets deferred, and deferred maintenance compounds over time, leading to longer repair periods, which means fewer carriers available for deployment, which means the carriers that are available get deployed more often and for longer periods. It's a vicious cycle, and the Truman crew got caught in it. Their extended deployment was partly because other carriers weren't ready to deploy, and those carriers weren't ready because they were dealing with their own maintenance backlogs from previous extended operations. Personnel management is another piece of this puzzle. The Navy, like all military services, depends on retention. It needs experienced sailors to stay in service, to provide leadership and expertise to newer sailors. But experiences like the Truman deployment crisis drive people out of the military. Why would a sailor re-enlist after living through 15 months away from family, watching their marriage fall apart, missing their child's first year of life? Why would someone choose to stay in an organization that broke its promises so fundamentally? The Navy saw increased attrition rates among Truman sailors in the years following the deployment. Talented, experienced personnel left the service, taking their skills and knowledge with them. The institutional cost of the deployment crisis extended far beyond those 15 months. Let me paint a picture of what daily life was like aboard the Truman during the extended deployment. Imagine living in a space smaller than a walk-in closet, shared with 5 other people. Your bed, called a rack, is a thin mattress on a metal frame stacked 3 high. You sleep in shifts because there isn't enough space for everyone to sleep at once. Privacy doesn't exist. You shower in communal bathrooms, eat in crowded mess halls, work in spaces packed with equipment and people. The air is recirculated, often smelling of jet fuel, cooking, and humanity. Natural light is rare. Most spaces are artificially lit 24 hours a day. You lose track of whether it's day or night. Time becomes measured not by sunrise and sunset, but by watch rotations and flight schedules. The noise is constant and overwhelming. Aircraft launching from catapults create thunderous booms that shake the entire ship. Jets landing on the flight deck produce ear-splitting screeches and crashes. Machinery hums and clanks continuously. Announcements blare over the intercom at all hours. Even in your sleeping area, the noise never stops. You learn to sleep through almost anything, but true rest is elusive. Your body is tired, but your mind can't fully relax. The stress hormones stay elevated. Your nervous system remains on alert. Month after month of this takes a profound toll on physical and mental health. Sleep deprivation becomes chronic. Exhaustion becomes your baseline state. And you keep working, keep performing your duties, because the mission requires it, and because your shipmates depend on you. Food becomes one of the few pleasures available, but even that grows monotonous. The Navy does its best to provide variety, but options are limited on a ship at sea for months. The same rotation of meals, the same flavors. Some sailors lost weight because they simply couldn't bring themselves to eat the same food again. Others gained weight, finding comfort in whatever food was available. Fresh fruits and vegetables ran out quickly on long deployments. Milk was a distant memory. Everything started to taste vaguely the same. Small things that people on shore take completely for granted, like a fresh apple or a cold glass of milk, became objects of intense longing. Sailors would talk about the meals they would eat when they got home, planning elaborate feasts in detail, sustaining themselves with fantasies of food that tasted like real food. Communication with home was limited and frustrating. Email was available when bandwidth allowed, but sending a message could take hours or even days depending on the ship's operational status. Phone calls were rare luxuries, available only at certain times and often with poor connection quality. Video calls were even rarer. When you did get to talk to your family, what do you say? How do you explain what you're going through in a 15-minute call where the connection keeps dropping? How do you help your spouse deal with a broken water heater or a sick child when you're thousands of miles away and can't do anything about it? How do you maintain a relationship when you can't be present for any of the daily moments that relationships are built on? Communication, that essential element of human connection, was reduced to inadequate fragments that often left both sides feeling more disconnected than before. Entertainment and recreation were limited. The ship had a small gym, always crowded. There was a library with a limited selection of books. Movies were shown in whatever spaces were available. But these distractions could only do so much. You couldn't go for a walk outside. You couldn't drive somewhere different. You couldn't visit friends. Your world was the steel confines of the ship and the endless expanse of ocean visible from the few weathered decks. Some sailors described feeling claustrophobic even though they were surrounded by the vastness of the sea. The psychological experience of confinement wasn't about physical space. It was about lack of choice, lack of variety, lack of control over your environment and your life. That feeling of powerlessness, of being trapped, intensified as the months dragged on with no clear end in sight. Religious services became important for many sailors during this time. The ship's chaplains worked tirelessly, providing not just religious services but counseling, comfort, and a listening ear for sailors struggling with the deployment. The chapel spaces aboard the ship were often full, with sailors seeking spiritual solace and community support. For many, faith became an anchor in the storm, a way to find meaning and hope in circumstances that felt hopeless. The chaplains themselves were also dealing with the extended deployment, also missing their families, but they set aside their own struggles to care for their flock. Their work during the Truman crisis was extraordinary and often went unrecognized. There were moments of beauty and connection even amid the hardship. Sailors formed deep bonds with their shipmates, relationships forged in shared struggle. There were moments of laughter, of humanity, of people taking care of each other. Someone would share a care package from home with their division. A group would organize a birthday celebration for a shipmate, finding creative ways to make someone feel special in a steel box in the middle of the ocean. These moments of grace, of human kindness, sustained people when everything else felt unbearable. The crew of the Truman, despite everything, looked out for each other. They became a family, a dysfunctional, exhausted, struggling family, but a family nonetheless. That connection, that sense of not being alone in the suffering, made the impossible slightly more bearable. As the homecoming finally approached in July 2019, the crew began to experience a strange mix of emotions. Relief and joy certainly, but also anxiety. They had been gone for 15 months. They had changed during that time. Their families had changed. Their children had grown. Their spouses had learned to live without them. What would it be like to return to a home that had moved on without them? How would they reintegrate into family life after more than a year of being gone? Some sailors felt guilty about their relief to be coming home, as if they were somehow abandoning the mission. Others felt anger that the ordeal had happened at all. Still others felt numbness, emotional exhaustion so profound that they couldn't fully feel the joy of homecoming. The human psyche is complex, and trauma affects everyone differently. The return to Norfolk was logistically complex, but emotionally overwhelming. As the ship pulled into port, as the first lines were secured to the pier, as the brow was lowered and sailors began walking off the ship, the reality of being home finally hit. Some sailors kissed the ground. Others stood in the Virginia sunshine, feeling natural warmth on their faces for the first time in months, letting tears flow freely. The reunion scenes on the pier were captured by news cameras and shared across social media. The images of parents meeting babies for the first time, of children running into their parents' arms, of spouses embracing after more than a year apart, those images captured public attention. For a moment, the nation paid attention to what these sailors had endured. But attention is fleeting, and after the news cameras left, the real work of recovery and reintegration began. Many Truman sailors struggled with the transition back to normal life. After 15 months in the highly structured, mission-focused environment of the ship, the freedom and choices of civilian life felt overwhelming. Some experienced symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Others dealt with depression and anxiety. Relationships that had been strained to breaking during the deployment didn't magically heal just because they were back home. Some marriages ended in divorce within months of the homecoming. Other relationships required intensive couples counseling to survive. Children who had bonded more closely with the at-home parent during the long absence sometimes struggled to reconnect with the returned parent. These family dynamics took time, patience, and professional help to navigate. The Navy provided resources, but resources can only do so much. The damage had been done, and healing would be a long process. From a career perspective, the Truman deployment had lasting impacts. Some sailors, as mentioned earlier, chose to leave the Navy rather than risk experiencing something similar again. Others stayed but requested shore duty assignments, avoiding sea duty for as long as possible. The experience created a generation of sailors deeply skeptical of Navy leadership and promises. When senior leaders said a deployment would be 7 months, Truman veterans remembered that their 7-month deployment became 15 months. That institutional trust, once broken, is incredibly difficult to rebuild. The Navy recognized this and worked to regain that trust, but for many Truman sailors, the damage was permanent. Their relationship with the institution they served had been fundamentally altered. The broader military community took notice of the Truman crisis. Other Navy units saw what had happened and worried it could happen to them. The Air Force, Army, and Marine Corps watched and reflected on their own deployment policies and personnel management. Congressional leaders held hearings examining what had gone wrong and what needed to change. Defense analysts wrote papers about force management and the dangers of overextending military personnel. The Truman deployment became a case study in military education programs, an example of what happens when operational requirements are prioritized over human welfare to an extreme degree. These institutional responses were important, but they couldn't change what the Truman crew had experienced. The learning happened after the fact, purchased with the suffering of 5,000 sailors and their families. Today, several years after the Truman crisis, we can assess the long-term impacts. The Navy did implement reforms. Deployment length policies were clarified and strengthened. The carrier maintenance backlog has been addressed, though challenges remain. Mental health resources for deployed personnel have been expanded. Family support programs have been enhanced. These are positive changes that benefit current service members. But we must remember that these improvements came at a cost. The Truman sailors paid that cost. Their sacrifice, their suffering, their broken relationships, and missed moments with loved ones, those were the price of the lessons learned. We owe them recognition not just for their operational service, but for the institutional change their experience sparked. What should we take away from the USS Harry S. Truman deployment crisis? First, that military service is not just about strategy and operations. It's about people. Human beings with families, with relationships, with emotional and psychological needs. When we forget that, when we treat service members as mere tools to accomplish missions, we break the fundamental compact between the nation and those who defend it. Second, that promises matter. When the Navy tells a sailor their deployment will be 7 months, that promise creates expectations and plans that ripple through families and communities. Breaking that promise has consequences that extend far beyond the individual service member. Third, that short-term operational gains can create long-term institutional costs. The Navy kept the Truman deployed because it needed the operational capability, but it paid for that capability with decreased retention, damaged morale, and broken trust that took years to repair. We should also recognize that the challenges the Truman crew faced reflect broader issues in American military policy. We have been at war continuously for over 2 decades. We maintain military commitments around the globe. We ask a relatively small percentage of Americans to bear the burden of these commitments. The all-volunteer force is a remarkable achievement, but it creates dynamics where the civilian population is largely disconnected from the costs of military operations. Most Americans weren't aware of the Truman crisis while it was happening. They didn't know that 5,000 sailors were stuck in an indefinite deployment, watching their personal lives crumble. There was no draft, no nationwide sacrifice, no shared burden. The Truman crew suffered while the rest of the nation went about their daily lives, largely oblivious. This civil-military gap is concerning and requires attention. Looking forward, the U.S. military faces continued challenges in balancing operational requirements with personnel welfare. Global commitments haven't decreased. Potential adversaries continue to develop capabilities that require American military responses. The Navy still needs to maintain carrier presence in multiple regions simultaneously. These strategic realities won't change in the near future. So how do we prevent another Truman crisis? It requires sustained commitment to adequate force sizing. Enough carriers, enough ships, enough personnel, so that the operational burden can be distributed more evenly. It requires rigorous adherence to deployment policies, even when operational pressures make extension tempting. It requires leadership at all levels prioritizing the welfare of service members alongside mission accomplishment. And it requires continued public attention and political will to invest in military personnel and readiness, not just equipment and technology. The story of the USS Harry S. Truman deployment crisis is ultimately a story about sacrifice and resilience. The sailors of the Truman endured 15 months away from everything they loved. They missed birthdays and holidays. They missed births and funerals. They missed the daily moments that make up a life. Some lost marriages. Others lost precious time with children that can never be recovered. All of them lost something during those 15 months. But they persevered. They continued to perform their duties professionally. They maintained one of the world's most complex weapons systems in operational readiness. They launched thousands of combat sorties. They represented American power and interests in a critical region. They did their jobs even as their personal lives fell apart. That is the definition of service and sacrifice. That is what we ask of our military personnel. And we must never forget the cost of what we ask. As we reflect on the Truman crisis, let's remember the names and faces behind the statistics. The petty officer who missed his daughter's first year. The mechanic who couldn't attend his father's funeral. The officer whose engagement fell apart under the strain. These weren't abstract concepts. These were real people with real pain. And there were thousands more, each with their own story of loss and struggle during those 15 months. They deserve our recognition, our gratitude, and our commitment to do better by future generations of service members. The lessons of the Truman deployment should never be forgotten, because to forget would dishonor the sacrifice of those who lived through it. The 5,000 sailors of the USS Harry S. Truman in 2018 and 2019 gave more than we asked them to give, more than we had any right to ask. And they did it with professionalism and dignity. That deserves to be remembered and honored, today and always.